The records say gas leak, the villagers say nothing, yet the walls still whisper about 6 children who were never buried. What do you call a silence that feels rehearsed? The file says gas leak, a line rupture, an old house sealed too tight, 5 deaths in a single night. The coroner signed it, the fire inspector filed it. The county clerk stamped it and pushed it into the archive where no one would ever look again. Case closed, tragedy explained, grief handled by paperwork. But if that were all it was, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be opening a record most people in this town still insist doesn't exist. Because in the years since that fire, the silence around the house at the edge of Marrow Lane has grown louder than the event itself. People cross the street rather than walk past it. Old neighbors swear the lot was always empty. The library map has been redrawn, the block shortened by one address. It's as if the house was never there. And yet, it was. We have photographs, grainy black and whites, from a county assessor's roll, a 2-story clapboard with a porch sagging at the corners. We have bills, electric spikes in the middle of the night, water usage higher than any family of 5 should ever need. We have the testimony of a nurse who worked 3 shifts at the hospital the week after the fire, who swears that only 2 children were admitted, both undernourished, both carrying surnames that didn't appear on any census. She told me, they didn't call them by name, they called them by bone. The town doesn't want this told. That much is clear. Try to interview longtime residents, and you'll get blank stares, polite refusals, or the same phrase repeated again and again. We don't talk about Marrow Lane. Try to access sealed planning documents, and you'll find whole years missing, shelves scrubbed clean. But in the gaps, things leak through. A photo tucked behind a church register, showing children in identical gray coats standing in front of a door that no longer exists. A police log from the week before the fire, noting strange chance reported, no units dispatched. A newspaper column spiked at the last minute, its headline still visible on the proofs. The children who never were. That is where we begin. Not with the fire, not with the official cause, but with the silence that followed. This isn't a story built on jump scares or whispered legends. It is built on what remains in the margins. Records too stubborn to burn, voices too frightened to name what they saw, and a house that breathed long after it was declared dead. Our pact is simple. I will show you only what can be traced, documents, interviews, fragments of evidence that survived the flames. You must decide what you believe. Because the Bonehouse was real. And what happened inside was never buried deep enough. The hospital ledgers are neat, almost comforting at first glance. Dates, times, intake numbers, diagnoses. The kind of order you expect from an institution built to catalog suffering with precision. But then you see 5 entries, spread across 6 years, each one carrying the same uncanny designation. Patient surname, Marrow, first name, unknown, guardianship, redacted. The handwriting shifts from clerk to clerk, the ink from fountain pen to ballpoint, but the pattern never changes. 5 children, none older than 12, admitted for malnutrition, fever, and in one case, burns that were described as ritualized in the attending physician's private notes. To a casual reader, it looks like clerical error, perhaps a lazy shorthand for unknown family, but the hospital never used Marrow as a placeholder anywhere else. In other intake records from the same years, unidentified patients are marked as Doe, child male or child female, sometimes with the street where they were found. Only these 5 bear the strange surname, always capitalized, as if official. Someone wrote Marrow deliberately. Who were they? Their files give only fragments. Heights and weights well below the average, scars noted but never explained, blood work ordered but results missing from the chart, vaccinations absent, allergies unknown. And the strangest detail of all, every child was discharged not into foster care, not into state custody, but to guardian on file, a line struck through with heavy black ink in the surviving copies. Legally, that should never have happened. Children without parents go to the county. Paperwork is mandatory. Yet these 5 walked out the hospital doors with someone no one is willing to name. I spoke to a former orderly, now in his 70s, who remembered one of them. She wouldn't let go of my sleeve, he said, his voice thin but certain. Big eyes, quiet. But when I asked her name, she whispered something I'll never forget. She said, "We don't get names, we get numbers." He told me he filed a note about it. That note is nowhere in the archives. So what do we make of it? A bureaucratic mistake repeated 5 times over 6 years? Or a deliberate erasure, a way of cataloging children who were never meant to be tracked, children funneled through the system under a name that wasn't a name at all, but a marker, Marrow. To the hospital, they were data points. To someone else, they were something more, something chosen. And the fact that no guardians were ever identified, no follow-up visits recorded, no school enrollments or adoption papers filed, suggests one thing above all. These children were never meant to leave a trail. They weren't lost, they were hidden. The county's foster rosters are supposed to be the most transparent of records. Each entry lists a child's name, birth date, placement family, and the duration of their stay. Some placements last weeks, others months, a few drag on for years. That is the nature of the system, temporary bridges built until permanence can be found. But when I traced the years surrounding the so-called Marrow admissions at the hospital, I found something else. A string of files that did not behave like the others. 5 placements, different years, different caseworkers, and yet each one begins and ends on the very same date. A child placed in the morning, withdrawn by evening. Guardians listed, but crossed through in thick pencil. Case status, closed. And in the margin, written small but unmistakable, the same phrase every time, returned to origin. The handwriting differs from file to file, but the words never change. Returned to origin, it is not an official term. No policy manual uses it, no training session teaches it. I asked a retired administrator what it might mean. She frowned, rubbed her temples, and finally muttered, "That's not ours, that's theirs." When I pressed her on who they were, she shook her head and ended the call. The files themselves resist scrutiny. Dates match no known removals. Birth certificates are missing or were never issued. Photographs that should be stapled to the inside cover are gone, leaving only rusted marks where paper clips once held them. In one file, a page of medical notes has been glued shut, the adhesive so old it has fused the paper into a solid block. Attempts to separate it risk destroying it entirely. It is as though someone wanted these children acknowledged just enough to be legal, but not enough to be remembered. The strangest entry belonged to a boy no older than 6. His foster mother, still alive, recalled the day vividly when I spoke to her. "They brought him at sunrise," she said. "Skinny little thing. Barely spoke. By dinner he was gone. No explanation, just a knock at the door. A man in a gray coat said he was here for the boy. When I asked where he was taking him, he only said, 'Back where he belongs.' I never saw him again." Her official paperwork shows the placement lasted 0 days. What origin could a child be returned to when the state itself claims no knowledge of their past? To a family that does not exist? To an institution that does not appear on any map? Or to something older, hidden beneath the neat folds of bureaucracy, where children were not fostered at all but cycled through, erased, and absorbed? The words "return to origin" may not just describe a destination, they may describe a purpose, and the county's silence suggests they knew exactly where these children went. Her name appears only once in the surviving personnel records, and even then it is half erased by a crooked ink stamp that reads, "Terminated. Night, shift registered nurse, St. Catherine's Hospital, 1960, 1965. No commendations, no disciplinary actions, just 4 years of service ending in silence." When I tracked her down decades later, retired and living quietly by the coast, She told me she still dreamed of the boy whose papers she refused to sign. It was a Tuesday, she remembered, near the end of her shift. A child had been brought in, frail, feverish, skin stretched too tight over his ribs. He had been listed under the familiar unsettling designation, Marrow, unknown. She did what she always did, checked vitals, soothed him as best she could, kept the chart neat for the morning team. But when the orderlies arrived to discharge him, the guardian line on the form was blank. No parent, no foster placement, not even the state's emergency shelter. Just a redacted streak of ink and the instruction: release immediately. Protocol required 2 signatures on a pediatric discharge, one from the physician and one from the attending nurse. She read the form twice, then refused. No child leaves this ward without a guardian, she told the doctor on call. He avoided her eyes, tapped his pen against the clipboard, and muttered something about exceptions. She pushed back. The boy clung to her sleeve, wide-eyed and silent, as the physician pressed harder, finally snapping that this was above her pay grade. Still, she refused to sign. The chart was left incomplete. The boy was taken anyway, and she watched him vanish down the hall in the arms of a man she had never seen before, dressed not like a parent, but like an official, gray coat buttoned to the throat. 2 days later, she submitted her resignation. At least, that is what the hospital's records claim. She insists she never wrote a resignation letter, never sat through the exit interview listed in her file. They wanted me gone, she said softly, eyes fixed on the waves outside her window. And they wanted the paperwork to look clean. When I asked if she remembered anything else about that night, she grew quiet. Then she whispered. The boy had a number written in marker on the inside of his wrist. Not his name, just a number. When I asked him about it, he said, "That's how they know which one I am." Her exit interview has never surfaced. Pages in the HR archive jump neatly from one employee to the next, as though her story was cut away with a blade. But her testimony fills the gap the paperwork left behind. She was the one who broke the silence, however briefly, and her refusal left a trace that even careful erasure could not fully hide. The fire was written off as another accident, one of many that scarred the outskirts of Marrow Lane. Official reports noted faulty wiring and accelerant traces, though no culprit was ever named. What drew my attention wasn't the ruin of the house itself, but the list of items recovered from its ash. Among the blackened timber and melted glass, investigators catalogued a curious collection. Lengths of twine knotted at irregular intervals, chalk sigils etched into scraps of charred plaster, and perhaps most unsettling, a string of tiny milk teeth drilled and threaded like beads. The evidence was logged, boxed, and sealed under miscellaneous decorative, a phrase that manages to say nothing at all. I found the photos years later in a county archive, tucked between routine fire inspection files. The teeth were arranged in a circle on a scorched evidence sheet, pale against the soot. Some still bore the jagged roots. Others were filed flat as if shaped to fit a pattern. The twine was singed but intact, its knots spaced with strange precision, neither random nor ornamental. The chalk sigils, barely visible against plaster dust, were spirals intersected by crude hand shapes, like open palms turned downward. When I asked a retired forensic analyst about them, he shrugged. Kids' crafts, he said. Someone's idea of folk art. But the photographs told another story. The items weren't scattered, they were clustered together in the cellar, protected from the worst of the fire. And on the back of one evidence tag was a note in pencil later crossed out, "Possible ritual use." I took copies of the photographs to 2 folklore scholars at separate universities. Both reacted the same way, leaning forward, squinting, their voices dropping as though the images carried weight. One pointed to the drilled teeth and said, "This is old, pre-Christian in some regions." Teeth were offerings, tokens of transition, sometimes given to the earth to ensure the child's spirit grew straight. The other examined the chalk spirals and shook her head. Not decorative, protective wards, inverted. Whoever drew these wasn't trying to keep something out, they were trying to keep something in. It is tempting to dismiss these charms as relics of a superstitious household, nothing more. But context matters. They were found on a property tied to children who never officially existed, in a cellar where neighbors swore they heard humming at night. The fire may have been meant to erase them, but the artifacts survived just enough to suggest intent. They weren't toys, they weren't crafts. They were instructions, written in bone and chalk, by hands too small to have carried the weight of what they were asked to protect. The house on Marrow Lane was never just a residence. On paper, it shifted ownership with an ease that should have raised alarms. Names of shell trusts and holding companies that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. Deeds signed by lawyers who left no forwarding address. Taxes paid one year and vanished the next. The county registrar's log shows at least 7 ownership transfers in a 15-year span, yet no sale records, no mortgage filings, no trace of real occupants beyond the neighbors who remembered children at the windows. Every attempt to follow the paper trail folds back into itself, a loop of signatures without faces, trusts without trustees, property that belonged to no one and everyone at once. Utilities, however, tell a different story. The house was alive in numbers that could not lie. Power bills spiked between midnight and 4 a.m., sometimes quadruple the average household use, then fell back to silence by dawn. The water lines showed sudden surges, thousands of gallons consumed in single nights, then weeks of near emptiness. And strangest of all, the gas company logged the basement meter as independent, an anomaly buried in technician notes. Secondary feed bypasses main. Client request. No client was ever listed. When I obtained the surviving ledgers, the patterns were unmistakable. Something was being powered under the floor, not appliances, not ordinary living. The spikes suggested machines, heavy draw equipment, the kind found in workshops or labs. But no permits existed for renovation, no inspections logged for rewiring. The county assessor who visited in 1963 noted only that the basement door was locked and the owner absent, leaving the line unable to access lower level, circled twice in his report. Neighbors remembered more. One woman, now in her 80s, told me about the low hum that rolled through the ground at night, like an engine buried deep in the soil. My kitchen glasses would tremble, she said, but in the morning the house looked dark, like no one had lived there for months. Another swore she saw steam venting from a hidden pipe near the foundation on winter mornings, though no boiler large enough for such discharge was ever listed on inspection. What was being fed under that house? The records are mute, but the suggestion is clear. It was not for comfort or warmth. It was for containment or creation, something that required secrecy and continuous nighttime use. The basement meter, independent and unaccounted for, is the only witness left. It ticked away in darkness, powering what the house itself refused to reveal. Whatever lived beneath Marrow Lane, it was not recorded in any official file, but the bills prove it drew power all the same. The reports came quietly at first, tucked into oral histories and neighborhood gossip, easy to dismiss as coincidence. Yet when you hear the same details from people who never spoke to each other, the pattern begins to demand attention. They all remembered the melody. Soft, slow, threaded through the night like smoke. No lyrics, just a rise and fall in a minor key, the kind of tune that lingers on the edge of memory. It was always around the new moon, always drifting from the direction of Marrow Lane. One neighbor, a retired postman, told me it was like a nursery song he couldn't place. Not cheerful, not sad, just hollow, he said, tapping the table nervously. My wife thought it was the wind, but I knew the wind doesn't keep count. When I asked what he meant, he hesitated before admitting that beneath the notes he sometimes heard voices whispering numbers. Always starting over after 12. These claims might have remained local superstition if not for the recordings. In the mid-1970s, a group of amateur folklorists visited the town, chasing rural songs and forgotten chants. One of them, curious about the rumors, left a reel-to-reel running overnight in a field less than 200 yards from the Marrow house. the tape survived. On playback, you can hear it clearly. The faint skeleton of a lullaby, wavering but deliberate. The folklorists assumed it was an old family tune. But when modern audio analysts examined the tape decades later, a spectrogram revealed something buried in the sound. The peaks formed shapes not from melody alone, but from whispered syllables. Counting, steady, low, threaded between the notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then silence, and a return to the minor refrain. A second recording, this one from the 1980s, came from a university research assistant testing wildlife audio gear in the same region. Again, the song surfaced. Again, the spectrogram showed numbers, this time broken and frantic, climbing into the 20s before collapsing into noise. When questioned, the assistant said he hadn't noticed it until playback. "I thought I'd caught owls," he admitted. "But owls don't count in English." What unsettles most is the consistency. Different decades, different equipment, different listeners all reporting the same song with the same absence of words. No verse, no chorus, just an endless minor loop stitched together by counting. What were the children counting toward? A ritual, a warning, or simply a way to measure how long the dark would last? Whatever the purpose, the lullaby persists as one of the only sounds the house ever gave back to the outside world. And like all lullabies, it was meant not to entertain, but to keep something asleep. The drawing is still kept in a manila folder, its edges frayed from years of handling, the waxy sheen of the crayon dulled but not gone. It shows a tree, simple at first glance, the kind any 8-year-old might sketch in school. A trunk, branches spreading like fingers, green crown heavy with leaves. But then your eye drifts downward, into the roots. They aren't roots at all, they are hands. Dozens of them, tangled and reaching, palms open, fingers long and uneven, some bent at odd angles as if broken. Each one extends deeper into the page, clawing for something unseen. On the reverse, in blocky, uneven scrawl, a sentence sprawls across the paper in red. "We live underneath." The guidance counselor who kept it retired now, long removed from the district, still remembers the girl who handed it to her. She was quiet, always quiet, she told me. Didn't like recess, didn't like noise, but she could draw for hours. The day she gave me that picture, she didn't smile. She just said, "This is where we are." At the time, the counselor filed it as a behavioral note, a possible sign of trauma or neglect. But when she tried to follow up, the girl's foster placement abruptly ended. The records list the case as reassigned, no explanation given. By the next term, her file had vanished from the roster entirely. No transfer slip, no forwarding address. It was as if she had never enrolled. The handwriting on the back unsettled even more. The counselor swore she hadn't yet taught cursive or sentence structure to that grade, yet the words were fluid, deliberate. Linguistic analysis later suggested it was modeled on older penmanship styles, the kind taught in the 1920s and 30s. How could an 8-year-old in the late 1960s have written that way without someone showing her? Who taught her that phrase, and why? Experts in child psychology I consulted gave cautious interpretations. Roots as hands, one said, could represent feelings of being trapped or unseen forces holding her. But the folklore scholar who examined it shook his head. "No," he whispered. "Hands for roots, that's not metaphor. That's cosmology." Old traditions held that the dead fed the living by anchoring themselves under the soil. To say we live underneath is to declare belonging to that cycle. The counselor never threw the drawing away. She said it felt less like art and more like a message, something the girl was told to deliver. And when she looked me in the eye, her voice cracked. I think she wanted someone to know where to look for them. I think she was trying to tell me the truth no one else would say out loud. The parish registers list him only as a temporary supply, filling in during a winter when the resident pastor had fallen ill. His name was given as Reverend Charles Turn, though no ordination records survive under that title, no seminary, no parish assignments before or after. For 6 Sundays in 1964, he stood at the pulpit of St. Brigid's, a chapel that should have been unremarkable, save for the fact that people still whisper about what he carried in his hands. It was not a Bible. Not even close. Witnesses described it as a small vellum-bound book, thick with age, its cover without title, its pages yellowed and frayed. Some said the writing inside was cramped, others swore it had no writing at all, just symbols that shimmered in candlelight like they were alive. His homilies were nothing like what the congregation expected. He spoke softly, always softly, as though afraid of waking someone not meant to stir. He talked of sacrifice, but not as charity or selflessness. He spoke of it as stewardship, as if the land demanded tending the way livestock demanded feed. "We keep the soil clean by what we give back," one parishioner remembered him saying, his voice calm, as though discussing crop rotation. Another recalled him describing children as the freshest roots, words that sent shivers even decades later when she repeated them. At first, the villagers accepted him. Rural communities are accustomed to eccentricity in the clergy, and his gentle manner disarmed suspicion. But when one farmer finally asked why he did not read from the Gospels, his reply silenced the room. He laid a hand on the vellum book, smiled without mirth, and said, "Because this is older than language." No one dared ask again. After his 6th sermon, he was gone. The official pastor returned, weak but recovering, and claimed no knowledge of who had arranged Turn's service. Letters to the diocese yielded only confusion. No such appointment had been authorized. The congregation split in memory. Some said he left the book behind, hidden beneath the altar. Others swore he carried it into the woods and never returned. Decades later, fragments of vellum surfaced during renovations in the church basement, scraps with spirals, crude tree-like figures, and one phrase written in Latin so archaic it barely translated. Radix mene ezuriens, the root remains hungry. Forensic dating placed the scraps at centuries old, long before Reverend Turn supposedly held them. The unsettling possibility is that he didn't bring the book at all, he retrieved it. And if that is true, then the sermons about sacrifice and stewardship were not lessons invented for that congregation. They were reminders, recitations of a covenant older than the town itself, spoken aloud just long enough to ensure no one forgot the cost of keeping the soil quiet. The photograph surfaced in a bundle of routine inspection records, tucked between images of wiring and drainage. At first glance it looks unremarkable. A concrete cellar, rough stone foundation, a work light dangling from a nail. But look closely at the far wall, and you see what the contractor saw: an outline too sharp, too deliberate. A false wall of plasterboard, slightly discolored where moisture bled through. And beside it, not the expected single stairway leading up to the kitchen, but another set of steps cut into the floor itself, narrow and steep, vanishing into shadow. "Two mouths," the contractor wrote in his notes, "one that feeds the house, one that feeds something else." No permit listed excavation. The original property files described only a shallow cellar for coal storage, nothing deeper than 6 feet. Yet the photo shows a stairwell descending at least another story, perhaps more. When the contractor asked about it, he was told to leave the wall intact. His invoice was paid in cash, and the file stamped compliant. He left behind only the photo, maybe out of unease, maybe because he suspected he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. Later attempts to revisit the site met resistance. County surveyors sent in the 1970s recorded the same cellar but found no trace of the second stairwell. Either it had been sealed completely, or the photograph captured a window of time when the lower room was briefly exposed. The question remains, what did that stairwell lead to, and why was it hidden? Oral accounts hint at what the files refuse to name. A neighbor recalled hearing work at night in the early 60s: dull thuds, the scrape of stone. Another remembered a convoy of unmarked vans parked along the lane, men carrying crates into the house long after midnight. They said it was repairs, he told me, but no one repairs a basement in the dark. Architectural historians who examined the photo pointed out details the contractor missed. The stone along the false wall didn't match the rest of the foundation. Older, darker, set in a style closer to dry stacking than modern masonry. It suggested the lower stairwell wasn't new at all, but a remnant uncovered, then concealed again. What did the lower room hold? If it was storage, why the secrecy? If it was structural, why no permit, no record, no follow-up inspection? The simplest answer is also the most unsettling. The lower chamber wasn't meant for utilities or safety. It was meant for ritual. A space beneath the house, beneath even the official cellar, carved away to hold what the rest of the building could not bear in daylight. The notebook was found in the ruins of what locals call the Bonehouse fire, half-burned and brittle, its spine warped from heat, but its pages still clinging together in stubborn clumps. Most of the ink had bled into gray smears, yet certain entries survived, legible in their precision. They were lists, nothing more at first glance, dates in tight columns, weights noted in pounds and ounces, and beside them a set of initials. No full names, never more than 2 letters, as if identity itself had been pared down to fragments, and threading through the pages like a refrain, one word repeated again and again. Marrowing. Investigators catalogued the book as a personal journal, though no analysis of the handwriting was ever conducted. Forensic teams noted the entries were written in at least 3 distinct styles, suggesting multiple hands, yet they dismissed this as the scribblings of a family keeping household notes. But the details resist domestic explanation. The dates were too regular, falling close to lunar cycles. The weights were not produce or livestock, they matched the range of children in early adolescence. And the initials cross-referenced against foster intake logs from the same years align uncomfortably well with minors who appeared briefly in state records only to vanish just as quickly. The word itself, marrowing, remains the most disturbing. Medical experts consulted decades later speculated it might reference bone marrow transplants, though no such procedures were recorded locally at the time. Folklore scholars offered another reading. Marrow as essence, the innermost part of life. To marrow could mean to hollow, to reduce a body to its core. One even pointed to medieval texts where marrow was described as the sweet root of the bone, believed to nourish both spirit and soil. The structure of the ledger supports the latter view. Some entries have ticks beside the weights, others crosses. One page bears only the phrase "yield complete." On another, the initials repeat with the note, marrowed, returned. Returned to what? To whom? No surviving file explains. Perhaps most chilling is the final page. Unlike the others, it bears no dates, no numbers. Only a single line scrawled larger than all the rest, as though written in haste before the flames consumed the book. When the marrow is taken, the root remembers. The handwriting is different, again, shaky, almost childlike. The ledger is now sealed in an evidence vault, though few admit to handling it. Officially, it remains an artifact of no consequence, the remnant of a household tragedy. But for those who have read its surviving lines, the possibility cannot be ignored. That it was not a journal at all, but a schedule, and the children of Marrow Lane were measured not as lives, but as units to be consumed. He calls himself a survivor, though the word hangs uneasy in the air, like he isn't sure he earned it. The interview was arranged through intermediaries, his voice filtered, his face hidden, but the precision of his memories leaves little doubt he was there. He says he was 10 the year the Bonehouse burned, though no records list his name. He doesn't tell me what family took him in afterward, only that he was warned never to speak of the cellar. Breaking that silence now, after 50 years, feels less like confession and more like compulsion. He describes what they called bone fasting. Days spent in darkness, nothing to eat except thin broth and water, sometimes nothing at all. They said it kept us clean, he whispers. that if there was no food in us, the marrow would be sweeter. He remembers lying on a stone floor with others, hearing their stomachs cramp and twist. Listening to the quiet crying that always stopped when the heavy door opened. He remembers the smell of damp chalk and candle smoke, the air close and sour, as though it had been breathed too many times before. Light deprivation was part of the ritual. For weeks, the children were kept underground. Only candles allowed, no sunlight. It wasn't punishment, he insists. They said the sun spoiled us. We had to ripen in the dark. His phrasing is matter of fact, like he's recalling farm chores, not childhood captivity. The way he describes it, the cellar wasn't a prison, it was an incubator. But what chills most is the rule he repeats, word for word, with the flat cadence of something memorized long ago. We feed or we are fed. He says the older children told it to the younger ones, whispered like a bedtime prayer. It wasn't shouted by adults, not carved into walls. It lived in their mouths, passed from child to child. The meaning was never explained, but he understood enough. If they didn't obey, one of them would be chosen instead. When I ask who wrote the rule, he shakes his head. It was always there. On the first night, they tell it to you. On the last night, you tell it to someone else. He believes it came from the book the pastor carried, the vellum one with no title, but he admits he never saw the words himself. It was the rhythm of survival, not authorship, that mattered. The boy who walked out isn't a boy anymore. His hands tremble as he speaks, not from age but from memory. They told us the marrow was the gift, he says quietly. But the rule, that was the curse, and it's still waiting under that house, for someone new to whisper it again. The receipts were routine, printed on yellow carbon paper, meant for kitchens and butcher shops, not a single family home. Yet, there they were, bundled in a county archive box labeled Miscellaneous Utilities. The dates spanned nearly a decade, the orders consistent. Weekly deliveries of bulk offal lungs, livers, marrow bones, stomach lining. Far too much for one household, even with livestock. The address was ordinary enough. A residence zoned single family, a modest structure tucked along Marrow Lane. Officially, it should have raised a zoning flag. Instead, the invoices were paid on time, always in cash, always signed with the same illegible scrawl. The butcher's driver, now a retired man with cloudy eyes, remembers more than the paperwork admits. He recalls pulling up his lorry on damp mornings, the smell of iron already hanging in the air. There was no one waiting in the yard, no adults with clipboards or aprons. Instead, a slot in the wooden door would slide open just enough for payment to pass through. He swears it was a child's hand that pressed the coins into his palm, small, quick, and trembling, as though someone stood behind it giving orders. He says he tried once to peer inside, leaning close when the slot opened, but a second hand slammed it shut. He heard a man's voice then, low and firm. Deliveries only. Why so much offal? Forensics later speculated it could have been used in ritual, the organs burned or buried in place of more precious offerings. Folklore scholars suggested something darker, that the waste parts were practice, a preparation, teaching hands too small to be surgeons how to cut, clean, and separate. Not butchers as a profession, but as wardens. Children trained in white aprons, learning what to do when the real moment came. The receipts note peculiar requests. Extra marrow bones, kidneys, fresh, unwashed, cartilage in bulk. Items rarely asked for by households, but commonly purchased by institutions experimenting with texture and endurance. One driver's note, scrawled on the back of a 1,962 invoice, reads only. Sound in basement. Crying? Told myself pigs. The zoning board, when later questioned, insisted they had no record of complaints. But neighbors remembered the smell. Boiled fat, acrid smoke that curled out of the chimney at night. Some thought they were running an illegal slaughterhouse. No one dared investigate. In the end, the paper trail speaks louder than testimony. Pounds upon pounds of organ meat vanished weekly into a home that housed no visible family. And the one detail that returns like a chill: the driver's memory of a child's hand, slipping payment through a slot, paying not with allowance money but with the quiet weight of obedience. Whatever was happening inside, the children weren't only victims, they were made accomplices, apron-clad wardens of their own undoing. The fire inspectors who walked Marrow Lane that night still speak with unease, though their reports are couched in the usual dry language of procedure. On paper, the Bonehouse blaze was catalogued as an electrical fault, origin undetermined, accelerated by old timber and poor ventilation. Yet when pressed in later interviews, two of the inspectors admitted there was something wrong with the way the smoke moved. They described it as if the roof itself were breathing, pulling in the flames instead of letting them escape. Drafts should carry smoke upward and out, but they watched it curl back down in heavy folds, sucked into gaps between rafters. Like lungs, one muttered years later. As if the house didn't want to let go. Their notes mention unusual residue. Floorboards in the main room were pocked with circular stains, some no larger than a teacup, others wide as dinner plates. Samples taken tested positive for iron, an element present in blood. Officially, the explanation was rust from nails leaching through water damage. Unofficially, the inspectors described the marks as soaked in, as if something liquid had been poured repeatedly in the same places over years. Beneath the boards, the subfloor showed darker rings, layered like growth lines, impossible to explain with a single spill. What unsettled them further was the smell. Burning wood gives off a sharp, clean smoke. This fire carried something heavier, sweet at first, then acrid, then unmistakably metallic. One inspector said it reminded him of slaughterhouse waste. Another said nothing at all, only filed for early retirement within a year. Neighbors who watched from the road recalled that the fire didn't roar the way most do. It pulsed, rising and falling in waves, as though the structure exhaled, paused, then drew breath again. Even the flames seemed to gather in patterns, circling before rushing toward the center of the house. It wasn't burning down, one witness told me. It was burning inward. The final report lists collapse of the roof as inevitable once the rafters gave way. But the inspector's field sketches, still preserved in a private folder, show arrows marking the smoke's flow against natural draft. Their annotations tell a different story. The fire didn't consume the house consumed the fire. And if the iron stains beneath the floorboards were truly what later chemists suspected, then the breathing roof was only the last performance of a house that had been fed for decades, not with timber or ash, but with marrow. The caseworker agreed to speak only after retirement, her pension secured, her name withheld. She had carried the weight of silence for 40 years, a silence that pressed heavier each time another file crossed her desk. She described the list without hesitation, as though rehearsed in her mind for decades. A column of children marked, resilient to placement, a phrase that meant no foster home kept them long. No adoption petition stuck. Instead of being flagged for further support, they were quietly routed to a separate ledger. That ledger bore a heading in block letters: Marrow Cities. The term had no official meaning. No training manual mentioned it. No supervisor explained it aloud. Yet the moment she saw it, she felt what it implied. These were destinations, towns circled for reasons no policy could justify. Their zip codes repeated: Ashworth, Elmrook, Grenale, 3 in the Midlands, 2 in the North. One she swore was crossed out in red ink, as if to erase the very name. It was a network, she whispered, and I was feeding it. The process was subtle. A child labeled difficult, withdrawn, or prone to dark imagination would be reassigned, not to supportive programs, but to families already vetted by unknown criteria. She noticed the homes shared patterns: isolated properties, foster parents tied loosely to churches, paperwork handled with unusual speed. Files vanished once transfers were complete. Placement reports came back stamped stable, even when she suspected otherwise. When she pressed for details, supervisors would wave her off. It's above your grade, they said. Focus on throughput. One day, curiosity overcame her. She traced a case herself, following the trail of a boy she'd placed in good faith. His file ended in a flagged zip code 3 counties away. When she visited unannounced, the house was empty. Neighbors said no child had ever lived there. 2 weeks later, her desk drawer contained a single slip of paper: "Do not audit Marrow cities." She never asked again. Now, looking back, she believes the children weren't lost, they were selected. The label "resilient to placement" wasn't a failure, it was a resource. Children without attachments, whose disappearances would raise fewer questions, whose files could be erased with less resistance. She has no number, no total, only the sickening realization that the list renewed itself each quarter, steady as a calendar. How many Marrow cities exist? Her voice broke when she answered. Enough that no one ever notices the missing. Enough that you stop thinking of them as children and start seeing them as dates, as units, as marrow for the root. The survey was meant to be routine, part of a redevelopment grant that required ground-penetrating radar to map soil stability around the old Bonehouse property. The technicians expected to find uneven bedrock, maybe old cisterns or utility lines. What the radar revealed instead was a narrow, linear void, barely wider than a crawlspace, running from the basement's foundation wall to a storm drain 50 yards away. The line was too straight, too deliberate to be natural. On the imaging printout, it looked like a vein running from a dark heart into the open air. When county crews opened the drain to verify, they found the grate rusted but functional. Beneath it, the tunnel's mouth yawned in the dim beam of a flashlight. Its walls were bricked crudely, just enough to keep soil from collapsing inward, and the floor was scored with shallow grooves, as if hands or knees had passed that way many times. The tunnel emerged less than a dozen feet from the elementary school's playground fence, hidden in plain sight for decades. Children had played tag within earshot of that hollow, their laughter carrying over the same ground where others once crawled in silence. The detail that chilled investigators most wasn't the tunnel itself, but what they found at its end. Just inside the grate, caught in the muck, lay 3 small shoes. They were mismatched, different sizes, different wear patterns, but all unmistakably belonging to children. The leather had stiffened with time, buckles rusted, laces fused into clumps. Forensic tests dated them to the 1960s, consistent with the years the Bonehouse was still active. One pair bore faint initials inked on the sole, L.H. No matching student was ever listed in the school rosters from that decade. Whose shoes fit? That question lingers unanswered. The school administration denied any record of missing pupils, insisting attendance logs from the era show no unexplained absences. Parents, when interviewed years later, claimed they remembered whispers, but nothing concrete: rumors of children who left to live with relatives, stories of sudden relocations that were never followed up. Some speculated the tunnel allowed for quick abductions from the playground, children pulled through before anyone could see. Others believed it was the reverse, an escape route for those locked beneath the house, leading them close enough to freedom to hear other children play, only to falter before the grate. The tunnel has since been sealed with concrete, but the image remains, a secret artery connecting a house of silence to a place of laughter. A reminder that the boundary between safety and horror was once no thicker than a wall of soil, and that the missing shoes belonged to someone the records still refuse to name. The hospital sits at the edge of town, a squat brick complex that has served generations with its rotating staff of midwives, surgeons, and family doctors. To most, it is unremarkable, just another provincial institution with scuffed linoleum floors and the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to every corridor. But tucked behind the main pediatric unit was a hallway staff once called the Quiet Wing, a place where windows were painted black on the inside and curtains never moved. The official explanation was simple light sensitivity, research protocols, but no parent could recall their child being admitted there. In fact, no one could remember anyone visiting it at all. Inside the archives, the wing barely exists on paper. Floor plans show the rooms, yet the admission logs list them perpetually vacant. Nurses who trained in the 1970s recall being told never to enter unless summoned. One described the hush that clung to the corridor, a silence deeper than any ward she had ever known. You could hear your own blood moving in your ears, she said. It wasn't just quiet, it pressed on you. In the back room of that wing stood a rolling freezer, waist-high, metal casing dented from years of use. It bore a taped label, lab use only, no further details. Its temperature logs, preserved in maintenance records, show something disturbing. For most of the year, the readings were steady, the kind expected of a unit storing blood samples or tissue slides. But 4 times annually aligned with solstices and equinoxes, the temperature spiked unnaturally high before plunging back down. When questioned decades later, technicians admitted they never reported the anomalies. We assumed it was part of some experiment, one shrugged, though none could name what experiment required heating a freezer on the longest and shortest days of the year. The chief physician overseeing the pediatric department, Dr. Edmund Rayner, retired suddenly in 1983. He was only 52. His colleagues were surprised he had been considered a rising figure, known for his calm authority and skill with difficult cases. Yet he left without ceremony, his resignation letter thin and vague, for personal reasons, effective immediately. He sold his house within weeks and relocated abroad, never returning to England. Attempts to contact him in later years failed. He had vanished as completely as the children listed under Marrow, unknown. Whispers among former nurses hint at what may have driven him out. Some recall seeing delivery carts pushed into the quiet wing at night, covered in white sheets that never stirred. Others remember the smell when the freezer was opened briefly, a metallic tang, not unlike rusting iron, drifting through the hall before the door shut again. None filed reports, they knew better. The quiet wing has since been renovated into offices, its windows uncovered, its walls painted bright. But the temperature logs remain, a cold arithmetic pointing to a rhythm older than medicine, older even than the hospital itself. Something was being kept there, something that required a cycle of heat and cold in time with the turning of the year, and the question that haunts those who look back was Dr. Breezy and Stive and Rayner's retirement, an act of guilt or an escape? The woman sat at her kitchen table, the curtains drawn tight even though it was midday. Her fingers trembled as she stirred a mug of tea she never drank, the spoon clinking against the china in nervous rhythm. She had lived on Marrow Lane her whole life, long enough to see the houses rise and rot, long enough to bury friends and watch children vanish without explanation. For decades she had kept her silence, telling herself the less she knew, the safer she would be. But now, near 90, she no longer cared about safety. She cared about the weight pressing her chest, the guilt that had never let her sleep. She leaned forward, her voice thin but sharp. "We called them the Marrow children," she said. "Because the town had hollow bones. We thought we were saving ourselves." Her words hung in the air, brittle and undeniable. She named names, families who had lived side by side with her, shopkeepers, even a schoolteacher. All of them complicit, all of them bound by the same desperate belief. "It began," she said, in whispers after the war. "Crops failed, sickness spread, and a man who wore a cleric's collar but carried no Bible promised a cure. He told them the land beneath Ashworth was tired, that its bones had grown hollow from neglect. Feed the marrow back to the soil, he said, and the town would prosper." At first, they thought he meant livestock, and for a while, that was true: calves slaughtered, goats buried beneath the church floor. But when those offerings no longer yielded harvest, the man spoke again. What feeds the soil must be born of it. Children, not animals, were what the root desired. The neighbor's hands shook as she spoke, but her eyes did not falter. "We believed it. We had to. Every bad year we said it was because the offering was too small, too late. And every good year, we told ourselves it worked. We convinced ourselves those children were chosen, that it wasn't murder but mercy. "We thought we were saving ourselves." Her confession did not absolve her. If anything, it deepened the wound. She admitted she never lifted a hand to stop it, though she knew what the blacked-out windows meant, though she heard the lullabies drifting from the Bonehouse cellar. She remembered the smell of iron on solstice nights, and the way grown men and women stood taller afterward, convinced they had bought another year of life. The names she gave aligned with records already unearthed, families tied to foster placements, to the butcher deliveries, to the Preservation Society. She insisted the rituals ended when the fire consumed the Bonehouse, but even as she said it, her voice broke. "We thought it was finished," she whispered. "But sometimes at night, I hear them still, counting. 1, 2, 3. Hollow bones in the dark." Ah! Her confession was written down, archived, and later dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman. Yet her words echo, a reminder that the Marrow children were not only victims of a hidden cult, but of an entire town's silence, a silence that masqueraded as survival. On demolition day, the machines arrived just after dawn. The Bonehouse had been condemned for years, its blackened shell propped up by scaffolding and official neglect. The crew expected the usual splintering beams, sagging joists, asbestos warnings. What they uncovered instead forced work to a halt before noon and summoned investigators who whispered more than they wrote down. Beneath the cracked foundation lay a cavity, not marked on any blueprint. It was broad, low, and deliberate, as though carved by hands that knew the soil's weakness. The cavity's walls were charred, not with the random scorch of house fire, but with layers of soot that suggested repeated burning in the same confined space. The floor was littered with fine gray powder that at first looked like ash but tested positive for calcium phosphate. Bone dust. Shards too small to identify were scattered among it, brittle as eggshells. Someone, over years, had reduced bodies to fragments and ground them back into the foundation. More disturbing still were the stitched dolls found pressed against the walls. Roughly sewn from burlap, stuffed with straw, and marked with crude spirals of red thread, they bore milk teeth threaded into their seams. Each doll was different, one with button eyes, another with a carved wooden face, some missing limbs. Investigators collected nearly 24, lined like sentries along the cavity's perimeter. Folklore scholars later noted their resemblance to protective effigies used in agrarian rites, but protection from what, and for whom, remained unanswered. At the center of the cavity was the most unsettling artifact, a cast-iron ring bolted deep into the earth. Heavy, industrial, and scarred with age, it defied simple explanation. The bolts sank so far into the soil they had to be cut with torches. Once removed, the earth beneath it showed signs of stress, as if something had strained upward against its hold. Engineers speculated it may have anchored machinery. Folklorists suggested something older, a ritual tether for binding rather than supporting. The iron was warped from heat, pitted from corrosion, yet still unnervingly solid, as though it had been made not to support weight, but to withstand pressure from below. Workers swore the air grew heavier near the ring. One claimed his breath caught, as if the cavity itself pulled at his lungs. Another refused to return after hearing what he described as faint knocking beneath the soil, rhythmic and steady, before the torches cut through the last bolt. Official reports mention none of this. They simply record non-structural artifact, removed and archived. But among the crew, the story lingered. They said the house hadn't burned from accident, nor crumbled from neglect. It had been holding something down, feeding it with ash, bone dust, and children's names sewn into dolls. And when the iron ring was finally lifted, some swore they felt the earth itself exhale. What survived the fire was not supposed to exist. In the rubble, sifting through beams collapsed into ash, investigators found a bundle of notebooks bound by twine, their covers scorched but their pages intact at the core. They were children's books, lined paper, uneven handwriting, doodles in crayon. They should have been dismissed as schoolwork. Instead, they became the last testimony of lives erased. The first notebook carried a transcription of the lullaby neighbors once whispered about. No lyrics, only phonetic syllables repeated in minor cadence. Na, ru, na, ru. A child had written beneath it, "This is how they make us sleep." The melody was traced in shaky lines, paired with sketches of moons and counting marks, always groups of 5, sometimes crossed out, sometimes left open. Spectrogram analysis decades later confirmed the tune matched recordings taken near the Bonehouse fence, the same melody that leaked through the walls on new moons. Another notebook contained what one investigator called a survival manual. At the top of the page, rules for the dark. The list was simple, brutal. Don't speak when the floor hums. Share your marrow or it takes more. If the dolls turn, don't look at their eyes. We feed or we are fed. The handwriting grew frantic toward the bottom. One final line was scribbled 3 times, each harder to read. Don't be last. Most haunting was a third book. On its inside cover, 5 names were written in block letters: James, Eliza, Matthew, Ruth, Daniel. Beneath them, faint and half smudged, was space for a 6th. No name followed, only a mark, like a spiral drawn by a hand too small to finish it. The official rosters list 5 Marrow children over the span of 6 years. But the notebook suggests otherwise. A 6th existed, unrecorded, unnamed, perhaps erased before discovery. Who that child was, and what became of them, remains unanswered. Equally disturbing was the discovery of evidence pointing to a second ledger. Fragments of burned parchment found near the iron ring bore cataloging marks not seen in the half-burned notebook, already archived. They referenced months not covered in the first ledger, and initials that didn't match any known victims. Somewhere, perhaps still hidden, another record exists, a continuation, or a parallel account of offerings beyond those already tallied. So we close here, not with answers, but with a question. Did the marrowing stop when the Bonehouse burned, or did it only move next door, to another flagged zip code, another quiet wing, another cellar with 2 mouths? The children's notebooks whisper rules, but not conclusions. Their lullaby lingers in field recordings, faint but real. Their shoes still rest beneath a grate near the schoolyard. Until someone can prove otherwise, the story remains unfinished. And history, as always, waits for someone willing to open the door again.